Hello, everyone. Jonathan Valentin here, author of the book The Wounded King, and presenting to you guys my second book, The Return of the King. Today, I'm going to be sharing with you chapter 2. Chapter 2 is The Weight of Expectation. James had always believed that if he worked hard enough, did the right things, and treated people well, life would eventually make sense. That belief carried him through school, through early jobs, and into the first years of adulthood. Responsibilities seem simple then. You work, you improve, you respect others, and you honor your commitments. If you follow those principles long enough, stability will follow. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. The expectations placed on him began to feel less like guidance and more like contradiction. The world did not simply expect men to grow, it expected them to constantly transform, often into versions of themselves that did not align. James first noticed it in small conversations, casual remarks, comments from coworkers, and social media posts that seem harmless at first glance, but carry subtle accusations beneath the surface. Men were told to be stronger, but also softer, to lead, but never to appear authoritative, to provide, but to not allow work to define them, to be emotionally expressive, but never unstable, to be confident, but not intimidated, to be protective, but never aggressive. Each expectation made sense on its own, but together they created something impossible. A man could not embody every demand at once without eventually fracturing under pressure. James did not resent expectations. In many ways, he believed they were necessary. A society without expectations dissolves into chaos. Standards shape characters, and responsibility shapes maturity. But expectations must be coherent. When they are not, responsibility becomes confusing. And confusion weakens men. He began to notice that many men around him responded to this confusion in one of two ways. Some lean into aggression, into masculinity was consistently criticized. They doubled down on strength, becoming louder, more confrontational, and more defiant. They rejected cultural criticism entirely and embraced a hardened version of masculinity built on dominance rather than discipline. But aggression did not bring clarity, it only created resistance. Other men responding by withdrawing. They stopped leading conversations, avoided strong opinions, and stepped back from responsibilities that might attract criticism. They learned to move quietly throughout life, careful not to appear too confident or too assertive, trading conviction for safety. But withdrawal did not bring clarity either. It only produced passivity. James found himself unsettled by both paths. Aggression felt reactive, and passivity felt dishonest. Neither reflected the steady, grounded strength he believed masculinity was meant to embody. The longer he observed, the more he realized something deeper. The problem might not be masculinity itself, but that masculinity had lost its definition. For generations, societies understood that men carried certain responsibilities. Men protected, built, provide, led families, and bore the consequences of their decisions. These responsibilities were not always fulfilled well, and history makes that clear. But they were understood. In modern Western culture, those responsibilities had not disappeared. They had become ambiguous. Men were still expected to protect, yet protection was often framed as control. They were still expected to provide, yet ambition was sometimes criticized. They were still expected to lead, yet leadership was often labeled as dominance. The role remained, but the language had changed. And that shift created uncertainty. James began to notice the psychological effect of that uncertainty. Some men hesitated to take initiative in relationships for fear of appearing controlling. Others struggled to discipline their children, afraid of being seen as harsh. Some avoided long-term commitments altogether, unsure of what will actually be expected of them. In many cases, men were rejecting responsibility. They simply did not know how to carry it. And uncertainty erodes confidence. He saw how this confusion spread across the entire communities. Young men entering adulthood often lack clear models of responsible masculinity. Some grew up without consistent father figures, while others had fathers who were physically present but emotionally distant. Some learned discipline through hardship. Others learned avoidance through instability. But very few learned structure, responsibility through intentional mentorship. The result was a generation of men trying to build identity from fragments, pulling from social media, figures who promoted exaggerated masculinity built on wealth and dominance, or from cultural messaging that encouraged them to soften ambition and avoid assertiveness entirely. Neither extreme offered a sustainable blueprint. James often wondered what young men were supposed to do with such conflict guidance. A man could hear two completely opposite messages in the same week. One voice tell him to become powerful, wealthy, dominant, and untouchable, while another tells him that masculinity itself is the problem, and that strength must be restrained or apologized for. Both distort reality. Power without discipline becomes tyranny, and strength without responsibility becomes weakness. Masculinity cannot survive at either extreme. James began to see the real issue. It was not that expectations existed, but that expectations had lost their hierarchy. In earlier generations, responsibility had order. A man's first responsibility was aligned with God. His second was stewardship of his family. His third was contribution to his community. His ambitions, achievements, and reputation came after. The order creates stability. When order disappears, expectations multiply. And a man begins chasing approval instead of fulfilling assignment. Approval feels rewarding, but it cannot sustain a life. Responsibility can. The more James observed the pressure men were under, the more he realized something unsettling. Many of these pressures were not coming from enemies, but from culture itself. A culture uncomfortable with authority, yet depending on responsibility. A culture that questioned leadership, yet requires stability. A culture that criticized masculinity while relying on its outcome. Men were expected to carry the weight, but rarely told how. This realization forced James to turn inward. Had he allowed expectations to shape him without questioning their source, had he adjusted himself to avoid criticism, had he stepped back from responsibility because the environment surrounding it felt uncertain. These questions were uncomfortable, but they were necessary. Because if masculinity is shaped by shifting opinion rather than anchored conviction, instability is inevitable. A man cannot build a stable life on a foundation that changes every year. He must build on something permanent. James was beginning to understand that the deeper crisis facing men was not criticism, but confusion. Criticism can be answered, confusion cannot. When a man understands his responsibilities clearly, criticism loses its power. He may be challenged or misunderstood, but he remains steady because his foundation does not depend on approval. But when responsibility itself becomes unclear, even strong men begin to hesitate. Masculinity does not need louder defenders. It needs clearer structure. And structure always begins with priorities. The world can debate endlessly what masculinity should look like. But the more important question is simpler. What is a man responsible for? Until that question is answered, expectation will continue to weigh down men who are trying to carry everything without knowing what matters most. And when responsibility becomes unclear, something else fills the gap. Opinion. Cultural opinion changes culturally. Cultural opinion changes constantly. Responsibility does not. James sensed that if men could rediscover the proper order of responsibility, much of the confusion would begin to fade. Not because culture would suddenly approve, but because approval will no longer be measured. Faithfulness would. And faithfulness does not require an applause. It requires clarity. James did not have all the answers yet, but he could see the outline of the problem. Men were not collapsing because they were incapable. They were collapsing because they were trying to carry expectations without order. And without order, even strength becomes unstable. The question before him was no longer whether masculinity mattered. It clearly did. The real question was whether men would rediscover the priorities that give masculinity its structure. Because without structure, expectations become weight. And weight without purpose will eventually break the man who carries it. This is chapter 2 for all of you guys. With a lot of love from yours truly, Jonathan Valentin. The Wounded King was my first book. Chapter 2, The Return of the King. Ready for you. Thank you for your support. Like the video, subscribe, and share it with other people so more men and more people can hear this message. Thank you very much.